Last week, my granddaughter was born, a moment I thought would change everything. For 30 years, I've carried the weight of my absence from my daughter's life, always believing there would be a day I could make it right. I imagined being there, holding that tiny new life, maybe hearing my daughter call me Dad without anger in her voice. But when I reached out, the words she spoke cut deeper than I ever thought possible. Dad, you lost the right to be there a long time ago. She didn't just bar me from the hospital. She closed the door on decades of hope. You might think this is where the story ends, but it isn't. Because what my daughter doesn't know is that I have 30 years of proof that I never stopped trying. Every letter I wrote, every birthday card returned unopened, every dollar quietly sent when she needed help but never knew it came from me. What happened when I showed her the truth? That moment would change everything. Again. Some doors slam shut forever. Others open in ways no one expects. Before we begin, remember this. Forgiveness isn't always loud, but sometimes the smallest message can shake the ground beneath you. I'm Richard, 65 years old, retired after 4 decades as a mechanical engineer. My home is quiet now, a small place on the edge of town, surrounded by maple trees and silence. I've been divorced for over 30 years, long enough for the bitterness to fade, at least for me. But for my daughter Emily, it seems the years only deepen the distance. Our relationship fractured when she was young. Her mother, my ex-wife, rarely spoke of me without sharpness in her tone. Whatever mistakes I made, my long hours at work, my absence after the divorce, were painted in the darkest colors. I never fought her version of the story, partly because I thought Emily would eventually see for herself, partly because I believed love could survive in quiet persistence. I never missed a payment for child support. Every Christmas, every birthday, a package or card would leave my hands with her name on it. Sometimes it came back unopened. Sometimes there was no acknowledgement at all. I told myself that was fine. What mattered was that she knew I was thinking of her. Then, one summer afternoon at the grocery store, I ran into Mark, an old friend of the family. We exchanged the usual small talk until he said something that stayed with me long after he walked away. You know, he said casually, Emily once told people at a barbecue that her father never cared. She sounded so sure of it. I stood frozen in the parking lot after he left, holding a bag of groceries that felt suddenly too heavy. It wasn't anger that hit me first. It was confusion. How could she believe that? Had my cards and letters meant so little? Or had they never reached her at all? That single comment replayed in my mind for weeks, like a loose screw rattling in an old machine. The truth is, our distance wasn't born overnight. The divorce itself was brutal. Lawyers fought over custody, and I was granted only limited visitation rights. Emily was 5, too young to understand the language of court orders or weekend schedules. She grew up with her mother's voice shaping her understanding of who I was. As she grew older, the visits became more awkward. Birthdays passed with stiff smiles and polite thank yous. By the time she was a teenager, the tension was thick enough to cut. At 15, I drove 3 hours to see her, unannounced but hopeful, only to find her standing in the doorway of her mother's house. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She simply said, "I don't think this is a good time," and closed the door. I remember sitting in my car afterward, staring at the steering wheel. trying to understand how years of trying could still end in silence. That day, I told myself I wouldn't push her anymore. I thought maybe space would do what persistence could not. But there are things Emily doesn't know. Things I never told her. Years ago, when she was about 12, her school went on a weekend field trip to the mountains. I wasn't on the invite list, of course, but I quietly paid for her expenses. It wasn't about credit or recognition. I just wanted her to have the same opportunities as the other kids. Months later, flipping through an old photo album, I found a picture from that trip. Emily was standing in the front row, laughing with her friends, holding a souvenir mug. She looked so happy. She never knew that I was the reason she could go, and I never told her. I kept that photo tucked in a drawer, like proof that even from a distance, I was still part of her life. It became one of many small truths that lived quietly in my house while Emily grew into an adult who believed I had walked away. Now, decades later, I find myself wondering if I made the wrong choice in staying silent. Maybe if I had spoken up, if I had fought harder, things would be different. But the past is a fixed point. I can't rewrite it. All I can do is decide how I will show up now, in the present, when the chance comes again. And until last week, I thought that chance had finally arrived. Years passed. Emily grew into adulthood, built a life of her own, and my role in it became almost non-existent. I tried to bridge the gap in small ways. When she got married, I mailed a gift, a simple, elegant clock I thought she'd appreciate. I received no acknowledgement, not a thank you card, not even a message. I convinced myself it might have been lost in the mail, though deep down I suspected she'd simply chosen not to respond. Later, I invited her and her husband to visit my home. It wasn't fancy, just a small backyard, a grill, and enough chairs for company. But I imagined her sitting across from me, maybe talking about work or the house they were fixing up. My invitation was met with silence. Weeks passed, then months, and eventually I stopped waiting. When she turned 30, I decided I couldn't just sit back. I loaded the trunk of my car with a carefully wrapped gift and drove 200 miles to her home. It was a long drive, but I imagined the look of surprise on her face when she opened the door. Instead, I found myself standing on her porch, gift in hand, knocking on a door that never opened. After several minutes, I noticed the curtain shift slightly. A shadow moved inside. She was home, but she didn't answer. I left the package on the step, drove away, and told myself it was enough that she knew I had tried. A week later, I returned to check if the gift had been accepted. It was gone, but no message came. That silence weighed more heavily than anger ever could. The real sting came a few months after that. I ran into her neighbor, an older woman tending her garden. She greeted me warmly enough, but then her words twisted the knife. "Oh, you must be her father. I'm sorry we never see you. Emily says you hardly ever come around." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mouth went dry. Emily had told them I never showed up. I'd driven hours, sent gifts, reached out over and over. To think she was painting me as absent by choice. It was as if my efforts had been erased entirely. I nodded politely to the neighbor, but inside I felt the hollow ache of betrayal. After that, I began to withdraw. There are only so many times a person can knock on a closed door before the sound of their own knuckles becomes unbearable. My world became smaller. I spent my days tending to the vegetable garden, repairing old tools in my shed, and writing in a journal that no one else would read. It was during these quiet months that I began writing letters to Emily. Some were long, carefully worded apologies. Others were short notes about things I thought she'd like to know, memories of her childhood, little updates from my life. I never mailed them. Maybe I was afraid they'd come back unopened. Maybe I just wanted to capture my thoughts somewhere safe. Over the years, those letters piled up in a small wooden box in my closet. The box became a kind of time capsule. Decades of unspoken words that never made it into her hands. One rainy evening, sorting through those letters, I found one I had written years earlier, the ink slightly smudged. It was a letter I'd never intended her to see, because it contained a truth I'd been too ashamed to explain. In it, I wrote about a parent-teacher conference when Emily was in middle school. She had wanted me there, and I had promised I'd come. But I never showed up. For years, she carried that as proof that I didn't care. The truth was far different. On the way to the school, I'd been in a car accident. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough to keep me from driving for weeks. I never told her. I thought sparing her the details would protect her from worry, but all it did was cement her belief that I had chosen not to be there. Holding that letter in my hands, I realized how many misunderstandings had piled up over the years, each one another brick in the wall between us. And I couldn't help but wonder if the wall had grown too high to ever climb. It was a Thursday morning when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. Most calls these days were telemarketers or reminders about dental checkups. But the voice on the other end was familiar. It was Linda, a mutual friend from years ago. "Richard," she said, her tone warm, "I thought you'd want to know. Emily had her baby, a little girl. Everyone's healthy." For a moment, the world seemed to go still. My daughter had just become a mother. I sat there in my kitchen, staring at the faded tablecloth, and felt a strange mix of joy and disbelief wash over me. A granddaughter, a fresh start. That night, I went into the attic and pulled out a small wooden cradle I had built decades ago. Back then, I imagined Emily's children someday using it. I spent hours polishing it, sanding out old scratches and sewing a new blanket to lay inside. It wasn't just a gift. It was a bridge, a way to show her that I had always been thinking of her future. In my mind, I saw it so clearly. I would walk into the hospital room, see Emily holding her baby. There'd be tears. Hers, mine. And maybe, just maybe, the years between us would start to dissolve. I even dreamt about it that night. A tiny newborn wrapped in pink, her tiny hand curling around my finger. Emily looking at me with something other than distance in her eyes. The next morning, I decided to call. I rehearsed what I'd say, careful to keep my voice steady and hopeful. When she answered, I smiled instinctively. "Emily, congratulations," I said. "Linda told me the news. I'm so happy for you." There was a pause. Then her voice, cool and measured. "Thanks. I'd love to come see you both," I began cautiously. "I have something for the baby." Her reply cut me off like a door slamming shut. "Dad, you lost the right to be there a long time ago." The words landed like a punch to the chest. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. All those years of waiting, of holding on to the hope that one day she'd let me in, collapsed in an instant. "Emily," I started, but she didn't let me finish. "I know everything," she said, her voice sharper now. "I know what you did." I froze. What I did. "You don't need to pretend," she said. "I grew up. I figured it out. I know the truth about all those years." I opened my mouth to ask what she meant, but before I could, there was silence. The line went dead. I sat there with the phone in my hand, staring at nothing. What did she mean by the truth? What exactly did she think she knew? The uncertainty gnawed at me as much as the rejection itself. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, replaying her words over and over. You lost the right. I know everything. It wasn't just a refusal to let me see my granddaughter. It was a condemnation, a final verdict on decades of effort she'd never seen. I got up, walked into the living room, and opened the box of letters I had kept over the years. Page after page of unsent words stared back at me. I wondered if any of them could change her mind, if showing her the truth might undo the picture she'd built of me. But for the first time, I feared it might be too late. For days, I couldn't shake her words. I know everything. They echoed in my head, relentless, impossible to ignore. What exactly did she think she knew? That I didn't care? That I had walked away willingly? I sat in my living room surrounded by silence, the same silence that had filled my life since she hung up. My eyes drifted toward the closet where the wooden box of letters sat. It was time to open it, not just the box, but everything I'd kept locked away. I began pulling out letters, some still sealed, others yellowed with age. Alongside them were receipts, records of payments, even copies of bank transfers I'd made when she was in school. I spread them out across the table, trying to piece together a lifetime of proof that I had never stopped being her father. As I sorted through the papers, I noticed something odd. Several payments I'd sent to cover school trips and extracurricular fees had been withdrawn in cash by her mother. There was no record of the funds being credited to Emily's account. My jaw tightened. Had those payments ever reached her? Or had her mother taken them without telling her? The thought hit me like a cold wave. All those times, Emily had insisted I never helped, never showed up. Was she speaking from a version of reality carefully constructed for her? The more I looked, the more patterns emerged. Transfers marked camp fees, book fare, and holiday gifts all ended the same way, withdrawn by her mother before they could ever be tied to me. I sat back, a knot tightening in my chest. Emily's version of the truth might be built on years of omissions and half-stories. Arguing over the phone wasn't going to change anything. Words over a line could be twisted, misunderstood. If I wanted her to see the truth, she needed to see it, literally. I decided I would not try to defend myself with excuses or angry rebuttals. Instead, I would put everything in front of her, quietly, and let her decide what to believe. I retrieved an old cedar box from my bedroom closet, the one I'd always planned to pass on to her someday. Inside, I began placing the most important pieces, the stack of letters I'd written over the years, receipts and bank records showing the transfers I'd made for her benefit, a photo album with dates and notes in the margins, documenting the moments I had been involved from afar. And then, tucked between the pages of an old photo book, I found something that stopped me. It was a picture of Emily at around 6 years old, sitting in front of a Christmas tree. In her lap was a large teddy bear, her face lit with a smile that could have powered the whole room. That bear had been my gift. I'd sent it through a third party because her mother refused to accept anything directly from me. Emily had always believed it was from her mother. I stared at the photo for a long time, my hands trembling slightly. She had loved that bear. She had loved a gift she thought came from someone else. I placed the photo in the cedar box with the rest. It wasn't about taking credit. It was about showing her that I'd been there, even if she didn't know it. The box was heavy now, not just with paper and mementos, but with the weight of years. Years of silence, misunderstanding, and lost chances. I closed the lid and sat back. I wasn't sure how Emily would react when I handed it to her. She might slam the door in my face. She might throw it back at me. Or maybe, just maybe, she would look inside. For the first time in a long while, I felt a strange kind of calm. I had no control over what she did with the truth. My only responsibility was to finally put it in her hands. It took me 3 days to gather the nerve. 3 days of rehearsing what I might say. 3 nights of imagining every possible outcome. In most of those imagined endings, Emily didn't even open the door. But on Saturday morning, I found myself parked outside her house. The cedar box sat on the passenger seat, heavier now than when I'd packed it. I stared at her front door for what felt like an eternity before finally stepping out. My hand shook slightly as I knocked. For a few moments, there was nothing. Then I heard footsteps. The door opened, and there she was, Emily. She looked tired, maybe from sleepless nights with the baby, maybe from the weight of years between us. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Dad?" she said cautiously, like she wasn't sure if she was seeing me or a memory. I didn't argue. I didn't rush. I simply held out the box. "You have the right to know everything," I said, my voice steady. Her eyes darted to the box, then back to me. She hesitated, but she stepped aside, just enough for me to walk in. The air inside the house was warm and faintly scented with baby powder. She didn't offer me a seat, but she didn't tell me to leave either. I set the box on the coffee table and removed the lid. Inside, the letters were stacked neatly, the receipts clipped together, the photographs carefully arranged. I didn't make a speech. "These are yours," I said. "You can read them whenever you want. They'll tell you more than I can right now." Emily stood there, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. I expected her to refuse, to tell me to take it all back. Instead, she pulled out the first letter, one I'd written on her 16th birthday, and began to read. The room was silent, except for the sound of paper shifting. As her eyes moved over the page, her expression softened almost imperceptibly. She read another letter, this one from when she was in college, congratulating her on an internship I'd heard about through a mutual friend. After a while, she reached for the envelope of receipts. She flipped through them, her brow furrowing when she saw the notations. School trips, camp fees, textbooks. Her hand paused on the photograph of her at 6 years old, sitting in front of the Christmas tree with the teddy bear. She stared at it for a long time. "This was from you?" she asked quietly, without looking up. "Yes," I said simply. She didn't respond. She just set the photo aside and kept looking through the box. I didn't press her. I didn't try to explain or defend myself. I let the box speak for me. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, she closed the lid. She didn't look angry. She didn't look overjoyed either. But there was something different in her face. Something less rigid, less closed. "I don't know what to say," she admitted finally. "You don't have to say anything," I replied. "I just wanted you to have the truth. What you do with it is up to you." I stood, feeling the weight in my chest lighten just slightly. I headed for the door, but before stepping out, I turned to her. "I'm still here, Emily. If you ever need me, for anything, I'll be here." She didn't answer. She just stood there, the box in her arms. I walked down the steps, half expecting to hear the door shut behind me, but it didn't. Halfway to my car, I turned back, and there she was, still standing in the doorway, holding the box. Her expression was unreadable, but she hadn't put it down. She was clutching it, not tightly, but with a kind of care, like it was something fragile. I didn't linger. I got into my car and drove away. The image of her in the doorway burned into my mind. As I turned the corner, I realized something. She hadn't asked me to stay, but she hadn't told me to leave and never come back either. It wasn't reconciliation. Not yet. But it wasn't rejection either. Sometimes, the smallest changes mean the most. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel for years. Hope. A week passed without a word. I didn't expect anything different. In my experience, silence had always been the default between us. But something about the way she had held the box lingered in my mind. She hadn't closed the door. She hadn't pushed me away. Then, on a quiet Friday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a new message. I almost didn't check it. I wasn't used to Emily reaching out. But when I saw her name on the screen, my heart tightened. "If you're free, tomorrow, come for dinner." I stared at the words for a long time. They weren't flowery. They weren't even warm. But they were an invitation. And in 30 years, it was the first one I'd ever received from her. The next day, I spent more time than I'd like to admit choosing a shirt. I told myself to keep my expectations realistic. This wasn't a reconciliation. It was dinner. Still, my hands trembled slightly as I drove to her house. When I arrived, the air felt different than the last time I stood on her porch. I knocked, and she opened the door almost immediately. There was no hesitation, no awkward pause. Inside, the house was warm, carrying the faint aroma of roasted chicken. I stepped in, careful not to look around too much, not wanting to seem like I was searching for evidence of myself in her life. And then I heard it, the soft, unmistakable cry of a newborn. My chest tightened. Emily disappeared for a moment, and when she returned, she was holding a small bundle wrapped in a pale yellow blanket. Her voice was calm, almost hesitant, as she stepped closer. "Dad," she said, "this is your granddaughter." The room seemed to fade away. All I could see was the tiny face, the delicate fingers curling in sleep. I felt the sting of tears before I could stop them. I didn't ask to hold her. I just stood there, absorbing the moment, the weight of everything it meant. Emily noticed my hesitation and, without a word, gently placed the baby in my arms. I'd imagined this moment countless times, but reality was different. She was warm, impossibly small, and heavier with meaning than I could have ever prepared for. We didn't talk much during dinner. We spoke about practical things, the baby's name, her sleeping schedule, how tired Emily had been. There was no mention of the past, no apology, no explanation. But for the first time in decades, we were sharing a table without the wall between us. After the meal, Emily stepped into another room to tend to the baby. I stayed in the living room, letting my eyes wander. That's when I noticed it, a small frame on the table by the couch. It was the photo from the cedar box, the one of me holding Emily when she was a child, both of us smiling in a rare, unguarded moment. I walked closer. Next to it, a new photo had been placed. Emily holding her daughter. Side by side, The two images told a story neither of us had put into words. Emily returned and caught me looking. She didn't say anything, just glanced at the photos, then at me. There was something unspoken in her expression, something softer than before. I didn't press. I didn't thank her or point it out. Some moments don't need to be narrated. When it was time to leave, I stood at the doorway, unsure how to end the evening. Emily shifted the baby in her arms and said simply, "Thanks for coming, Dad." It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd heard from her in years. I nodded. "Thanks for having me." As I stepped outside, the air was cool, the evening just settling in. I walked to my car, my heart heavier and lighter at the same time. There was no grand reconciliation, no sudden erasure of the years apart, but the door was no longer shut. A crack of light had opened, just enough to see the possibility of more. On the drive home, I thought about the years I'd spent waiting, the letters I'd written, the moments I'd missed. I realized something. I couldn't change the past, but I could show up now, again and again, in ways that mattered. Patience had been my only currency all these years, and maybe, just maybe, it was starting to pay off. Not in forgiveness, but in the fragile beginnings of trust. Back at home, I set my keys on the counter and glanced at the empty space in my living room where my own photos sat. I imagined, someday, there might be a new one, a picture of me with my granddaughter. But for now, I was content with what I had. A dinner, a brief invitation, and a photo placed in her home. It was enough to tell me that our story wasn't over. And maybe that was all the hope I needed.